sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All of the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all of their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Parishadatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Horatha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arishai, and Eridai, and Bizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they laid no hand on the plunder. So things went pretty well, right? I think that's more or less what those 10 verses sum up, is that things went pretty well. The counter order did exactly what it was supposed to. The day came, and the Jews were not destroyed. The Jews were able to fight off their enemies. It reads very straightforward again. And as we've kind of been noting since about chapter 6, everything's so straightforward because the battle was already fought. This is just cleaning up the loose ends. It's dealing with the outworking of it. God had already moved and ordained what was going to happen. The turning point has already really occurred. This is just following the tide out. One of the things that I find interesting looking at this is not only were the enemies of the Jews afraid that the Jews encountered, but so were the satraps and the governors. They were all afraid of Mordecai. And if you think about it, for Haman to have enacted the plan that he enacted, he would have had an awful lot of government officials that would have been complicit in helping make sure that his orders and acts were followed. And Haman's now dead, and he's now been replaced. And I think all of these people are sitting there like, oh, I think I bet on the wrong horse. Mordecai's the guy who's in charge, and I was on the other side. How can I make it up to Mordecai? We see something similar happen in Genesis with Joseph's brothers, when they suddenly get this realization of, oh, that's Joseph up there. And their first thought is, oh no, we're in trouble. But in Joseph's story, the brothers weren't in trouble. And here we see a similar sort of grace out of Mordecai. We don't see Mordecai abusing his power. We don't see Mordecai going through the Persian government, clearing away all of his enemies, much the way that Haman would have. Mordecai is decidedly different than Haman in the position that Haman was in. And I think that's something that we are meant to see. So when the day comes, we're specifically told that Haman's sons were killed. We're given the names of Haman's sons that were killed, which seems like an unnecessary detail, to be honest. They could have said, and the 10 sons of Haman were killed. But in fact, if we actually were to pick up a Hebrew Bible, all of Haman's sons' names are right justified on the page. So in a Hebrew Bible, not only are they listed, but they're listed on their own line. Your eye is drawn to it physically on the page. They're highlighted as enemies of God's people. And one of the biggest questions the book of Esther posed was, how will God respond when his people are threatened when they are in exile? When they are not in the promised land? And the answer that we see here is clear. God's people are God's people, whether they're in exile or not. And God addresses his enemies, whether his people are in exile or not. I'm going to continue onwards. That very day, the number of those killed in Susa the citadel was reported to the king, and the king said to Queen Esther, "In Susa the citadel the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows." And so the king commanded this to be done, and a decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. And the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 14th day of the month of Adar. And they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and got relief from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it that day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who lived in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So things went so marvelously well that the king asks Esther if she wants a little bit more. And I find this to be an interesting and perhaps somewhat troubling development. Now, firstly, on the king's side, they don't have the internet. There's no easy way to report what's happened throughout the whole kingdom. It's going to take months for all that information to come in, but the king's blunder is going to cost the lives of 75,000 members of his kingdom for his poor lawmaking ability. And he doesn't seem to be concerned about the number of people in his kingdom that are being killed through this process. And so he offers the queen, well, things have gone so well. Do you want to press the issue further? Do you want to take another step? And perhaps I find it surprising that Queen Esther says yes. She restricts the order to the citadel. Probably that's a practicality. Again, information doesn't travel so quickly. It's not like in the course of a day she could give the entire kingdom order. She can give it to the city that she's in, but she's like, we'll give them another day to pursue. The purpose of the original edict was to allow the Jews to defend themselves. But the second day, granting them the ability to pursue, this gives the Jews the ability to become the aggressor. The people that you had confrontation with that you did not kill, you now have another day to go track them down, to go finish the job, clean it up. I find that notion to be just a little bit excessive. I don't know if I feel like Esther's request here is justified. Esther gives no motivation for why she requests a second day. And honestly, the narrator doesn't, and nor does the narrator condemn her for it. But there's a sense in which Esther is looking a little bit more like Haman than I feel comfortable with how she's responding to her enemies. Sometimes when we look at our biblical heroes, I think we imagine them to be these peerless individuals that led these perfect lives of holiness, that all we have to do is follow and be like them in order to do great things for God, for the kingdom. I think that's sometimes the image that we walk away with. And I think throughout the story of Esther, we have seen Esther stand in her imperfections. There's been multiple decisions that we've seen from Esther that make us hesitate to want to be just like her. There were decisions that she made throughout the story in her walk, in her situation, that aren't necessarily decisions that we can just take and copy. It's a reminder that God can use us in our own imperfections. For God to use us and do wonderful things does not require us to be perfect. If God needed perfect people in order to work in them, God would not be working in people. There would be no options available. God works in us while we are imperfect. And he works through the imperfections. And he can do that. And he can work wonderful things while using us in our imperfections. I think so many of us have this image of, oh, I cannot be used by God to do these wonderful things because of the mistakes that I make. And so when God calls us to things, we step back and say, no, I cannot do that. I'm not good enough to do that. You don't understand, God. I'm flawed. I'm not capable, and God understands very clearly that we're flawed. And God says, I know you're flawed. I can use you anyways. So perhaps we look at Esther and we see some of her flaws standing out. But God still nonetheless used Esther to enact a plan of salvation for his people. We're told in this small section of Scripture 3 times that the Jews did not lay hands on the plunder. In the edict, it was made clear that the people who were going to attack the Jews would be allowed to plunder them. In the counter edict, it was made clear that the Jews could counter-plunder their enemies. But here it's been very clear that the Jews did not lay hands on the plunder. For the author to tell us that 3 times, it must be significant. One of the facets we talked about last week was holy war. And one of the things that happens in holy war is that you are to not lay your hands on the plunder. Holy war is not an opportunity for you as an individual to prosper and grow. Holy war is an opportunity for God to confront and address evil. Do you remember the story of Jericho? A popular Bible story in which they were commanded, go and completely destroy the city, don't take any of the riches, the plunder, nothing. Go and completely destroy the city, but there was the one man who took silver and gold and some fine clothing from it. And because this man Achan took this plunder for himself and he personally profited, God refused to continue to give Israel favor in battle until it was addressed and dealt with. 1 Samuel chapter 15, we see Saul and Agag, whose conflict is almost being mirrored in the story of Esther. It's not the first time that those names have been brought up in the story, but Saul's sin that he commits is laying hands on the plunder when he was supposed to completely destroy. We see that mistake is not made here in chapter 9. The Israelites do not lay hands on the plunder. They execute this as though it were holy war, as though this was them expunging their enemies as God would have commanded. I think we would feel very differently about the story if the Jews did use this as an opportunity to enhance their own wealth. If this situation turned into where the Jews were just going out and plundering like their enemies would have liked to have done to them. We are meant to see that the Jews are responding to this like God's people and not like their enemies. There's no attempt at selfish gain being made here. And this makes their deliverance feel like something that we can celebrate about, rather than something which just presents another spiritual problem for the Jewish people. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all of the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is, lots, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the term Pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter and all that they had faced in this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them, that without fail they should keep these 2 days according to what was written at the time appointed every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation and every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Then the Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, gave full written authority confirming this second letter about Purim. The letters were sent to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fasts and lamenting. The command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. So these events become a holiday on the liturgical Jewish calendar. There are two responses that we as people should have to God's deliverance, and the first is celebration. Celebration is important because celebration is binding. This event was meant to unite the Jews together. It solidifies them as God's people because they walked through this experience. This experience becomes part of them. There's an old Swedish proverb that says, "A shared sorrow is half sorrow, and a shared joy is double joy." When we celebrate and we share the good things that have happened, the joy that we experience becomes the joy that other people can experience. And I would dare say, when we share our joys, we experience that joy more ourselves. I think of my children, and whenever my children are enjoying something, their first instinct is to go to someone else and try to help them get that experience and share it with them. Because everything is better when it's done that way. As a community of believers, as a church community, it is important that we celebrate together. That we allow our experiences to bind us together as God's people and as a holistic community. See, I would even argue that celebration is central to our mission as Christians. When we experience the powerful movement of God, it fills us up, and it should pour out of us. It should overflow out of us. And I think that becomes the basis for our testimony. We testify about the good things that has happened, and other people hear about them, and other people can know based off of what we choose to share. But sadly, I think many of us have a poor priority when it comes to celebrating. I think we view celebration as an extra, probably because it's enjoyable, and we see that as the primary reason why you celebrate, is for your own personal enjoyment. And because it's for your own personal enjoyment, there are other, you can prioritize it lower. Sometimes it doesn't make the list of things that are worth spending your time on. But when we see the good things that celebration does for us as a community, and how celebrating and testifying truly impacts other people, I think that shows us that the priority should be there, because it's not always about us. Even in good things like celebration, it's not about us. It should be about us as a community. celebration is an outworking of holy living. It's something that should be a natural part of the Christian life and Christian walk. Just as we talked about last winter, the importance of when you were in a season of lament, being able to go to God and say, God, I'm struggling. I need your power and your presence here. And I don't have anything more that I can give than crying out. Just as we said that that was important, it's equally important for us to be going to God and saying, God, everything is wonderful. And everything is great, and blessed be your name. The second response to God's deliverance that we should have is to remember. And I think that this is just merely an extension of what happens when we testify to things that happen. The Old Testament, in numerous places, talks about the value of remembering, the value of looking into the past and seeing God's faithfulness and keeping that firmly planted in your mind. Frequently in the Old Testament, God identifies himself as the God who took you out of Egypt. The Jewish consciousness should always remember the fact that God brought them out of Egypt. And that should serve as a baseline for their relationship with God. The fact that he brought them out of Egypt. Again, remembrance shapes a community. It shapes us as a group of believers together. And it's not always about remembering our own struggles and victories and blessings that we've seen, but remembering each other's. When we testify about the good things that happen to us, other people can then see and use those and remember those. We believe in the unseen, but not necessarily the unexperienced. We can say, I know my deliverance is coming because I have walked this road before. But perhaps more appropriately, we can say, we know our deliverance is coming because we have walked this road before. King Ahasuerus imposed a tax on the land and the coastlands of the sea, and all of the acts of his power and might, and the full account of high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the magnitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all of his people. Sunrise, sunset. Life continues to go on. New taxes pop up. The Jews aren't threatened again. No, Mordecai is there to protect his people. We have seen many, many wondrous things throughout the book. And yet this is the one spot where I feel like everything feels really flat and stale for me. We've talked before that, God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. And I feel like here it should be, shouldn't it? Shouldn't this end with praise to God? But it really doesn't. And I read that and it just brings a reminder to me of the importance of actually remembering. Actually keeping the time that was set aside to be holy. You see, you can celebrate the holiday of Purim without actually really remembering God's faithfulness. You can celebrate that secularly. You're celebrating a deliverance that occurred, not necessarily God's deliverance. And I think we can do the exact same thing with our holy days, with our testimonies. We actually need to remember the God behind them that brought them forward. We actually need to remember the good and faithful things that were done in our celebration. That makes these experiences holy, rather than experiences that are secular. When the celebration that we have is kept holy, it retains that power of faith, of faithful encouragement, and that reason to have a hope in tomorrow. When we simply allow our celebration to not remember, we find ourselves not connecting with the true power that we had experienced. We're not carrying it forward. And it's not going to be able to encourage us in the same way. There's power lost when we do that. Couple of takeaways for us here. God will protect his people, whether they're in exile or not. And perhaps this is the big takeaway from the book of Esther, is that God has his hand on his people. God does not need us to be perfect to serve him, so feel free to step out today in what God is calling you to do. We should respond to God's deliverance with celebration. Celebration binds God's people together and should be present in a holy way. God's deliverance needs to be remembered, and this gives us encouragement for future struggles. And we need to strive to keep holy days and that which is holy from becoming secular, from things that no longer have power in our lives. And there we have it. We've made it through Esther. I will close us in prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for being a real God that has shown his power and his love and his faithfulness to his people. We want to praise you for the wonderful things that you have done, not only in our lives as Christians, but in our own personal walks, for the wonderful things that you have given us. I want to pray that as we look forward, and life is often difficult, and there are trials and struggles and things that we encounter, I want to pray that we will remember your faithfulness in those moments. We will remember what you have done and what you are capable of doing. And I want to pray that we will find peace in that remembrance.